where I will discuss user threat models for using Vault applications. And this was work done with my awesome collaborators, Natalie Chen, Kieron Turk, Jevan Hutson, and Damon McCoy. So what are Vault apps? So these are mobile or desktop apps which hide certain files such as photos or videos or even other apps. And typically it does this by requiring some sort of authentication from the user before the folder or album can be opened. To give some examples, iOS Photo Galleries has a hidden album. Google Photos also has a locked folder. And Snapchat has something called the My Eyes Only album. There are also other apps which aren't built into other existing photo gallery apps, but instead exist primarily to hide files and photos and other videos. And some of these also often offer other privacy-enhancing features, such as being able to disguise the app as something like a calculator. So some of the media surrounding Vault apps have talked about how parents should watch out for children having an app like this on their phone because it means they're hiding something from them. And in some cases, Vault apps have been used for storing non-consensually taken images of a sexual content. So Vault apps can be used for nefarious purposes. In terms of research, there isn't a lot focusing on Vault app usage specifically, but tangentially, a study on intimate media in the US have found that some people use these to store consensually stored and consensually taken intimate images. And also, another paper, which I believe just won the Test of Time award, found that women in South Asia sometimes use these apps to store other kinds of apps, and as well as intimate media in order to keep it private. Researchers on the security of Vault apps have found that technologically savvy adversaries can easily access these Vault apps. But there's still a research gap in answering what are the adversaries that users are actually using Vault apps for, and are they for technologically savvy adversaries? So to address this gap, in our study, we asked, what are everyday user threat models for folks who use Vault apps in the US? And do Vault apps meet their privacy needs? To address these questions, we conducted a qualitative research study where we conducted semi-structured interviews with 18 participants who are all adults who use Vault apps in the US. We used an inductive coding process and double-coded all interviews. We asked questions like, what concerns prompted participants to start using the app? What are the features they like or want? And also, what do they store on the Vault app? Now we'll get into our results. So just at a very high level, the assets people stored were often sensitive files, and the threats they were mainly concerned about were unintended audiences seeing these files. And the harms they discussed mainly were around if an exposure happened to someone they didn't want to see these files, it could bring up feelings of embarrassment or shame, loss of dignity, questions or lectures from family, or old memories in oneself. As for the assets that people stored on Vault apps, this included, unsurprisingly, sexual imagery of others or oneself, which has been found in prior work. But we also found that people often stored non-sexual body photos in these apps. So this could include gym progress photos, selfies, outfit photos. And we did have one participant who was undergoing transitioning, and they stored images to track their transitioning process. Some folks also stored photos of partying or drinking, and I'll get a little bit more into this in a little bit. People also stored photos of old partners. The reasoning behind this was that they wanted to keep these photos as keepsakes, but didn't always want to be reminded of them every time they opened their photo or gallery app. Some participants also use Vault apps to store sensitive documents, such as government IDs, office IDs, particularly when they were traveling and needed easy access to these files. And also, interestingly, some participants created their own ad hoc password managers where they basically stored a list of their passwords in one of these Vault apps and used it to easily access what they needed when they needed to log into an account. Finally, some folks use Vault apps in order to store medical photos or conversations that they deemed were sensitive. And just to give one example of that, so we had one participant who had a bipolar disorder diagnosis, and they were basically told that because they were in a small town and there was a lot of stigma around that diagnosis, they were told to basically hide this diagnosis. And so they ended up storing screenshots and files related to that within a Vault app. We also had some participants who mentioned that they, because they are of a marginalized gender, we had one woman participant who mentioned that they take extra care with storing their sensitive, not safe for work photos because they're aware that they may experience greater harm because of that, which is corroborated in prior work. Now I'll talk a bit about the different threats that people use Vault apps towards. So one, folks were particularly concerned around shoulder surfing. If you don't know what that is, basically, if you have your screen out, someone behind you might be able to accidentally see what's on your screen. Participant 2 described this as, when I'm in public, I'd rather not have some of those intimate images that are far back to be shown as I'm scrolling, because I take a lot of public transit. I'm usually around a lot of people. So I want to make sure that those images aren't accidentally shown when I'm in some of those more social situations. So in this case, participant 2 has an understanding of what contexts are not the desired context for these kinds of images to pop up. Other folks also talked about being concerned about accidental exposure while sharing a device. So to give one example, one participant would often give their phone to someone else to share some photos they took of an art exhibition, and they didn't want their friend to accidentally scroll through and see something that they shouldn't have. Finally, some participants also brought up a concern of parental device snooping. Now, this isn't an accidental exposure, but in this case, we had some participants, despite being over 18, still had parents who would occasionally go through their phone, look through their files, and go through their apps. As participant 17 describes, even though I'm over 18 now, I have regular checkups on my mobile phone. Since my parents do regular checkups, they know my password to open the phone, but for the secure folder that I have hidden the password from them. So for participant 17 specifically, they have slightly more conservative parents who don't approve of seeing their friends drink or engaging in sort of any party activities. So participant 17 would store photos of those memories within a Vault app to make sure that their snooping parents would not find them. So just to give a quick summary, most of the adversaries that participants talked about in this case were accidental. So these were folks who would be within physical proximity of the participant, which would include friends, family, coworkers, as well as the general public. We also talked to participants about the various affordances that they liked or did not like when using Vault apps. And so some of the affordances that people talked about were considered good for some participants and not good for others. I won't go into every single different affordance trade-off here, but I do want to bring up specifically the contrasting desires for biometric authentication versus PIN authentication. So some participants said they preferred biometrics because it was so quick and easy to access their files, so they were thinking a lot about usability. And then we had some participants say that they preferred having a PIN authentication scheme because they were concerned about accidentally opening these files where someone could see them, and were a little less they were more concerned about the lack of friction before opening up these files. Now I'll get into some key takeaways. So first, I just want to point out that there can be a misconception that Vault app usage is nefarious. Even though it can be used to store evidence of criminal activities or can be used to store non-consensually taken intimate images, people also had a lot of different use cases for using Vault apps, often to set boundaries between people that they have relationships in their life, but also to basically prevent context collapse. So context collapse is a term coined in social media research to talk about how audiences may post something on social media and not want everyone in the audience to see it. And in this case, Vault apps basically kept certain files private unless they intentionally wanted someone else to see it. Of course, participants also had an awareness that these tools would not prevent technologically savvy adversaries from accessing their files. So when we talked to participants, they said they use them mostly for accidental adversaries and not targeted hackers, corporations, or the government, even though those were privacy and security concerns they mentioned. And so finally, we made some design recommendations based on participant responses. I'll mainly just get into authentication, but we had several participants mention that they preferred having additional authentication options beyond just what the default of the phone provides, which is a requirement for iOS Photos and Google Photos locked folder. And some participants also wanted the option for extra friction before opening files. So thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'm happy to take any questions.